Hello and welcome to my talk. Today I'll be presenting on audio artifacts in language archives from cataloging to referencing and citation. My name is Hugh Patterson. I'm a recent graduate of the University of North Dakota, and I am currently at the University of Oregon. And this presentation is for the 2021 Conference of the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives. My research in this presentation comes out of research I did as part of my thesis. And in that research, I looked at how do people engage with archives. Primarily, I was looking at how people engage with the content and the reuse cycle and the scholarly communications components of that cycle. So how do people make records of the materials they consult at archives in tools like Zotero? And then when you go to write with those tools like Zotero or write your a scholarly communications piece, how are those units of reference treated in the bibliography section of the paper? And these are important across academia for tenure and promotion. Tenure and promotion offers are often connected to career point to publications. And by way of example, here at the bottom and the screen, we have a white component of text, and this is a reference that might appear in a bibliography. And Roger Blench is a depositor, in 2003 of the Niger-Congo Fields materials, and it's in the RB5 collection at the Pacific Regional Archive for Digital Sources and Endangered Cultures. And that institution's hosted in Sydney, and there's a DOI, of course, for digital electronic access. Broadly, in the archival field, we have a commonly adhered to standard called DAX for a description of archive content and collections. And there's a principle there in DAX called respect de fonds. Respect de fond. And this basically is let's create an organizational system that respects the provenance of the materials and the creation of the materials. And to do that, we are often divide materials into the collection level and the series level, the subseries level, the file unit level, and the item level. And such a flexible system with 5 tiers allows for arrangement and description of series of aggregate works and their components. And it allows for description at various levels and so the description may be broadly applied or narrowly applied depending on where the item is. And for many in the archive community, this is well known and well understood, this organization system. And I discussed this in my thesis on page 24 in the following discussion of that section. And so but many who are practitioners of their art who submit to archives or submit content to archives are unfamiliar with this system. So I discuss it here a little bit for that reason. And just so that we don't slip into a way of thinking that, oh, that's for archives of paper products or physical objects. This reference system is also endorsed or promoted and used by the best practices recommendations for the French National Audio Preservation Organization. And they produced a nice book in French for oral and cultural heritage of audio and sound materials. which is widely used in France and is the accepted norm in France. Of course, I mean, France is one country, but and language archives exist across the world. But I find, having read through their book, from what I read very little French, but I read some French, and I find it very encouraging, very useful materials there. And they discuss the respect de France on page 23 of their book. Let me just say a few words about preservation context for ethnographic collections. Ethnographic collections are in archives all over the world, and many before the digital era were split on the basis of media type for indexing, for browsing, and preservation strategies. So audio went to the audio archive, and papers went to the paper archive, and photos went, or maps went to their respective locations where they were managed. And today, as many materials are produced born digital, questions exist as to, should we still split media across this way, or should materials that are produced together be managed and preserved together? What we do know so far is that in many places, ethnographic collections, even when they're born digital, are split to sound archives or audio archives, video to larger file storage solutions, and so there are still constraints. There are still management practices that will split a collection, even though a hard drive is still a hard drive, and it doesn't really matter what you put on it. So that's just to say that's a quick overview of diversity in ethnographic collection management today. I'm going to talk specifically about language archives, and language archives, I'm distinguishing those from other kinds of archives. There are many archives in the world that hold exemplars or materials from minority language or ethno-linguistic minorities around the world. For instance, there's a large archive at the University of Indiana and UCLA, at least in the United States, and I think there's one in Berlin and the Austrian National Archive. So just in the British Library and the National Library of France, they both contain materials like this as well. But language archives, as a distinct kind of idea, I would say has its roots in a presentation by a linguist by the last name of Krauss, and he presented in 1992 at the Linguistic Society of America, and gave a passionate appeal to linguists and their moral responsibilities to engage not just with minority language and ethno-linguistic minorities as subjects in research, but as partners in bettering their existence and their goals in using their languages, as many minority languages were and still are in decline in their use. So in that context, then, it birthed kind of a new subdiscipline of linguistics known as language documentation. And that subdiscipline has as a tenet the use of archives. And so language archives, as I'm defining it here, has a very strong connection to the linguistic partnership and between the academics and indigenous communities, or as linguistic research and the linguist in the archive. So most of the materials in language archives are born digital, just by nature of when language archives are how I've defined them. Often language archives are associated with the Delamon network, which is a network of archives interested in preserving ethno-linguistic materials, dominantly born digital materials, but not solely born digital materials. And often these archives hold content created as part of the academically funded collaborations. It's not always the case, but it's generally had its foundations in university contexts. Materials are often created from the perspective of the field of linguistics and linguistic research. And they often contain language materials from lesser spoken languages of the world. And this distinctions I've previously made, they're split from traditional archives, and where traditional or long-standing archives and often deal with physical media. It's often not the case that physical media is dealt with in language archives, but it's not always the case. There are exceptions. Often language archives are organized and managed as digital repositories, and there's an ongoing discussion within the field of linguistics and archives in general of how to engage with new communities of users of content and repatriation of materials, or how to do preservation for non-digital materials and even digital materials. The digital repository nature is certainly there, as in material comes in and it's stored faithfully, and then it's given to the next user faithfully. But what other activities such as description or arrangement of collections, which would traditionally be done at an archive setting, how does that apply to language archives? In some cases, it doesn't seem to clearly apply. So just by way of a timeline, archives here in the red on the bottom, I will be talking about Paradisic, Ilar, and Kayapulohone. But in my thesis, I covered 2 additional archives as well. We can see across the top, if we go, that was kind of towards the bottom, if we go to the top, archiving standards for description have evolved over the years. DAX came out in 2004 or 2005, and DAX second edition 2013. In my research, I looked at publishing style sheets. So for instance, APA 6th edition came out in 2010, and Chicago 17th edition came out in 2015, 2017, around there. And in linguistics, major statements were made in the field in 1992, like I talked about Krauss already. In Himmelman, 1998, he published a seminal paper that kind of defined language documentation, and in that is the role that researchers should have with archives. It's not, it's overtly in his paper that the preservation of our research work should be available to future generations of researchers, and there's some discussion on that. But his main focus is on the entire endeavor of language documentation, not just the archiving component. And the preservation of digital materials is also addressed in Burden-Simon's seminal paper in 2003. Like I said, the archives will be discussing the arrangement of their records with some use cases. And Kayapulohone is from the University of Hawaii. The Pacific Regional Archive for Digital Sources is in Endangered Cultures is in Australia. And the Endangered Language Archive, ELAR, is at the Berlin-Brandenburg Institute for Humanities and Sciences, I believe. So if we look at ELAR first, this is on the right, we have the top portion of a record here. We have some metadata across the top, and then we have some files in the bottom section. And broadly, what we can see if we look at this in a tree view is that there's a collection, Ancestral Life Part 2, Kaleng Village, and then there's a node, and this is the node view that we see on the right, Kel Historical Life Part 2, presumably again, or at least number 02. And then the files that we see on the right are the files that are part of that node. What we don't see here is any sort of connection between collection part 1 and collection part 2. We don't see any connection either between the files or any description and the files that make up Kel Historical Life Part 02. So in that sense, there's not a clear, the arrangement and the description, they impact each other. And we have a 3-tier with 2 descriptable tiers system here. We'll find that this system also is in Kayapolo Hone. We also have the similar system of collection and then a node and then multiple files. In this particular case, this is a case where there was a cassette tape. Its format is marked as a Maxwell UR 60-minute cassette. And it was presumably digitized to a WAV format, and then a MP3, a derivative MP3 was presumably produced, but that's not explicit in any sort of provenance on the record. And the various manifestations are all nested under the node, and their interrelationship is not overtly part of any sort of metadata schema, and there's no direct metadata for the files, any sort of technical metadata about that. Now, there are several collection notes in early records of the collection. So this is the 18th node in the collection, and there's, I think, only 18 items. And if you go and look at the other collection items like 001, you can find some information about the collection. So, but there's only a really small multi-sentence, maybe 5 sentences about the collection on the collection page. So there's no real description on the collection. Most of the descriptive power is in the node, and then the files are, again, not interrelated with any sort of relationship. Metadata. Paradisic is a major archive in the linguistic space around the world. And collection RB5 is the Roger Blanche 5 collection that I mentioned previously on a previous slide. And then there are node items in the paradisic model of collections. And let's see here. So I think there's 105, 106 items in the RB5 collection, but in this particular collection, there's only 26. Well, let me say it this way. In the collection, there's 106 items, and then in this item, there's 26 files. Items can have an unlimited number of files, and the relationship of the files to each other inside of the item is not overtly stated, at least in the user interface, for scholars and community members to engage with. Multiple interrelated files exist, but now one thing that I think is useful to understand from an archivist point of view and from a linguist point of view is that in linguistics, there are, like other audio collections, there are aggregate works. So works that are made up of different components, just like a song might be an aggregate work of the text and the melody, or a film might be the visual stream and the audio channel. So also in linguistic and ethnographic research, we have video and audio of perhaps of the same event plus a transcription, and those might be derivative of the transcription might be derivative of the audio rather than the video. So the relationship of those things, now if we consider each of those an item, and then use a larger hierarchy to connect those with the descriptive power of that hierarchy, that's obviously one way to describe things. But linguists face a challenge with creating multimodal aggregate works. Let's see here. So if we look at the tree difference, we can see that, like, the collection level, and then the node level, and then kind of a conglomerate of different files doing different things together, that may be related more directly or maybe more indirectly related, depends on the collection. And this stands in contrast to, over the short tree stands in contrast to a longer tree with more descriptive, with more nodes and description possibilities at each node, such as is described in DAX. So we might say, well, the tree looks good. And the challenges, though, in linguistic archiving and archiving of these materials is that we have multimodal aggregate works where the aggregate parts would do well to be independently described as individual items with interrelated relationships declared. And that's in most collections that I've encountered in the language documentation, pardon me, in the language documentation archive scene, don't follow that sort of descriptive practice. So in the case of the Kayapolo manifestations, two different manifestations were which could be described in independent records, which would have variations in carrier and variations in provenance, were actually conflated to a single record. Reference patterns in publishing style sheets make allowances for different carriers and for distinguishing the different manifestations from each other. So, for instance, APA and Chicago, they both allow for an author to use the collection font, sous-font, and item level information as they're building a reference for material. And just because it's digital, it doesn't make it any less a video object or a audio object. So some conclusions and some relevant points. Each artifact is different, right? The creation story of every artifact is different. And so we still need descriptive power to address that. And the management at archives are also different. By and large, though, language archives don't follow DAX, which could be to their detriment, or could be a different opportunity to speak into the archival community about how good-natured descriptions can be done without following tools like DAX. Um, one of the challenges, though, when looking for language materials is the variation in description practice, where you have the lumping of materials at the item level, is it doesn't allow, for instance, for computerized like API type searching across archives to pull out particular types of files that would be relevant for ongoing use in different kinds of ways, whether that be website redistribution and engagement strategies for repatriation of materials, or that be computerized modeling of audio and different languages and detecting audio types by language. And so the variation in arrangement inhibits that and mitigates against easy use of APIs or the development of APIs for use across archives. And the reuse of artifacts is limited to manual engagement with content. So this means that the ability to actually engage with it, because it can't be done at a large scale via an API, either at the institutional level or across institutions, researchers are often need to engage with, or not just researchers, but any person needs to engage with the content manually. And in some cases, such as the ELAR case, the servers can be slow, and so the engagement process can take some time. And it is through the internet, so it's a little bit faster than traveling to the place where the archive would be located. So it's more accessible, yes, but maybe accessibility can always be improved. Lower engagement suggests that lower citability for content as data. So if we look at the larger picture of the interests of academics, often for scholarly communication and for the dissemination of information, that a collection is available and is useful for certain things, then will be cited in certain ways and referenced in papers and things like that. So if materials are less available, then they need manual engagement, then that more hands-on engagement suggests that the materials are less likely to be encountered because there's a higher barrier of engagement with the materials. So I want to say thank you, and I'm willing to accept questions. And here are some references from the materials that I referenced throughout this talk. Thank you very much.